Welcome back to Cold Hammered Archaeology. Today, I'm going to be going through the process of making a copper awl, very similar to what we'd see in the native copper industry here in North America, particularly similar to those we're going to see in the old copper complex. Previously in my videos, I have covered some of the basic tools that are going to be used in the native copper industry. Today, out of those tools, I'm going to be using a anvil stone, as well as 3 different types of hammer stone and a sandstone abrader. Along with this, I will also be using an air gas torch to do my annealing. I've also covered previously talking about the different types of forging methods that are going to be taking place, or at least potentially taking place. Today, I'm going to be using cold hammered. And now what cold hammering means, or cold forging, is that I will be working my piece that I've selected at room temperature with periodic annealings. Now the piece I've selected for today is a small piece of copper. It's about 25 grams. If I come up to the camera, give you a better view of it. It's actually quite square and very homogeneous in its makeup. There are some flaws that have already formed here at the top with some cracking, so I'll have to be careful of that as I'm going through working. But overall, the piece seems very solid, at least on the outside, but you never really know until you start working into the piece and actually begin the process of working it through. So as this is a piece of glacial float copper from the Keweenaw Peninsula, I'm actually going to start this process by annealing. And from there, I'm going to get into the hammering process. First, working this down into a preform, so breaking it down from its original form. Again, this piece is already quite square in origin, so I'll be flattening this down into more of a bar shape, and then forming it down into a awl itself. An awl is a perforator, and it would be used, for example, in leatherworking, in piercing a hide. So I'm going to be basically forming this down into a very sharp instrument that is sharp potentially on one end. Most of the awls that we actually find throughout the old copper complex are only pointed on one end. That being said, we do find them pointed on both ends. So my goal here is to make a single-sided pointed awl out of this piece of copper here. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to go anneal this, and when I get back, we will begin the actual hammering out of this piece. So this is the station that I do my annealing at. It is a designated hot working area. I'm going to be taking my piece of copper here. I'm going to be heating it up to roughly a nice cherry red with my air gas torch here. And what this is going to do is it's going to recrystallize the structure of the copper, and it's going to keep it from becoming brittle. That being said, the piece will become brittle as I continue to work it, and that is why this is going to be a continual process going back and forth between our annealing here and our working over in the hammering room. So I'm going to go ahead and anneal this piece, safety first, using my glasses, or goggles actually, and then we'll go back into the hammering room and we'll begin cold working this piece. As you can see, not very closely, but this piece is nice and hot. It's actually a nice bright, first a cherry red, now it's kind of getting to the bright orange. The hotter the piece gets, the less time you need to allow it to retain that heat in order for it to anneal. If you're working at a lot lower of a temperature, you do have to sustain this heat for a lot longer. But as I was able to get this piece up quite hot using some little modern help, I'm able to anneal this process a lot quicker than I would otherwise, for example, using a wood fire. So I'm going to let this piece cool here, and we will head back into the hammering room, and we will begin our cold working process. So I am back in the hammering room, and my piece has just been freshly annealed, and I am now ready to begin working this. Again, as I work this, it is going to start becoming brittle, and it's to become less ductile. So it's important as I work it, I pay attention to different signs that the piece is starting to become work hardened. A really good example of this is if I tap the piece right now, there's a lot duller sound to it, versus when I actually begin to work harden, it's going to become a lot harder. Now, generally, I do this by time. As I work, I like to anneal more than not. If I start to become afraid that the piece is becoming more brittle or becoming more work hardened, I will go anneal it. You'll also feel the more ductility of the piece as you go and as you work. You're going to be working it down. The piece is going to move a lot easier, versus as you go along, it's going to take more force to be able to make any sort of deformation in the piece. And usually at that point, you're going to want to anneal it so that it does not become work hardened and it does not break down. So again, the first step, this is pretty square, is I'm going to start flattening this edge here so that I can have a nice long bar in order to make my preform. So I'm going to begin by hammering along this edge. Now, as I hammer, it's going to deform out along the side. So I'm going to need to not only hammer along this edge, but I'm also going to have to hammer along the edge perpendicular to my working surface. I'm going to start with quite a large hammerstone to allow me to do some of this earlier work. As I go along, I'm actually going to switch to smaller hammerstone sizes, depending on what exactly I'm working, in order to exert the amount of force that I need. If I'm working later on, it's becoming a lot more delicate and I'm using my bigger piece, I'm going to risk damaging the piece as I go. But starting off with the smallest piece is going to take a lot more time than it will with the larger piece. So let's begin the hammering process. Okay, so I begin to work that piece down. You can see it's already starting to flatten along this top. You'll also notice it's a little uneven as there's more of a bulk of copper here versus here. So what I'm going to continue to do is I'm going to continue to work this piece down and try to even this out so that these two ends here, this end and this end, are parallel to each other, and that this is essentially forming a rectangular bar. Now, as you notice, that sound is getting a lot harder. While the whole piece hasn't been hammered yet, we do have a lot of deformation along the top, even the bottom, which is taking the blunt of the blow even against the hammerstone. So I'm going to go and run this through another annealing process, and then we'll continue working through the hammering. So I'm back from the annealing process. I'm going to continue working this piece down and flattening it out. So the piece is beginning to flatten out quite well. It's actually quite deformed at this point, but as I keep working, it'll begin to flatten out in uniform. One of the things you'll notice as you're working a piece of copper is you start to get a lot of little flakes coming off of it. And this is why we have our abrader handy. And then we just take the abrader and we can actually take these right off. I just had some little ones there, one on that side. This not only cleans up the piece as you go, but it also prevents future damage. If you get a large flake that is then allowed to get pressed in and worked out, that could potentially fracture and splinter later on. So if you're able to knock that off right off the bat with your abrader, you solve that problem before it even began. So I'm going to go run this through another set of annealing and we'll keep where I'm working. So I'm back again from annealing and we're just going to continue to work this piece down into a bar. Again, using our larger hammerstone. Okay, you'll see again, this is becoming a lot more uniform and it's slowly working its way down into a bar shape. So let's anneal again and we'll keep going. All right, so we're back again from annealing and we'll continue to work the piece down. Again, using the abrader to take off some of these flaking pieces. Okay, so at this point, we're getting a quite nice bar coming out of this. We have more or less parallel sides. These ends are still kind of deformed from the pounding out. We'll be able to flatten that up next time. I'm going to go anneal this, and we will continue to flatten this up. At this point, we're starting to go from, we're entering our stage of, I would call this a bar, probably through the next annealing process or so. And we're going to begin moving into creating what's called a preform. The preform is going to be kind of the general outline of the piece we're going to make. In our case, we're making an awl. So this piece is, again, for our preform, going to start thinning out and becoming elongated, and that's going to be our awl preform. So again, continuing to work this piece down into a first a bar currently, and then a preform. Starting to flatten out both of the ends there, pounding them down onto each other. So at this point, we have a very solid bar being formed. You can see it's very uniform and parallel both along the tops and the sides. And this is now on its way to becoming a preform. So we're moving out, starting to move out of the bar stage now in our next series of annealing, and we'll be drawing this out and making our preform to our awl. All right, we're back from annealing, and we're going to continue to work our bar into a preform by drawing it out and thinning it. Continuing to work both along the tops, bottoms, and the sides. So we're starting to get our preformed awl. As you can see, this is becoming a lot longer than it was before. It's also becoming a lot thinner and a lot shorter than it is. So we're going to continue to draw this out, and this will essentially become more of a square shape when we're looking this way, but nice and long as we look this way. So I'm going to go ahead and anneal this again, and we'll continue working it out. So we have our annealed preform that's been thinning out. As I mentioned at the beginning, the piece that we started with was quite homogeneous, and this has more or less remained true as we began to work it. No major flaws have began to form that have caused our piece to break apart, and the flaws that I noticed at the beginning have stayed relatively stable, and we've been able to successfully compress them up until this point. And I mention this now because as we thin this out, this is the point where we're really going to start to see if this piece is indeed as homogeneous as we thought. And this is also where any flaws might start to pop up and start to influence our work. At that point, we'll have to start adapting, but I'm hoping that this piece remains relatively solid and we won't have to worry about that. So let's continue to draw out our preform here. Now, as I'm going through and working this piece, I'm actually being careful where I strike every time. You can't really see where I'm exactly looking because I have the camera focused down here. But every strike is a coordinated strike. I'm not just hitting the piece randomly as I go along, but instead I am purposefully trying to shape this piece and striking different places in order to control the deformation of the bar itself. So again, we have a nice large kind of little thin flaking piece coming off there. I'll use our abrader to pull that right off. Grind that out. Another piece there that I just took off. And again, this is allowing us to prevent flaws as we go along by removing those flakes before they become a structural problem for our piece. So as you can tell, I don't know if you can hear that with the microphone, it might be too high pitched even. This has a nice high pitched metallic ring to it, telling us again that this needs to be annealed. Our preform again is getting even thinner than it was previously. So let's anneal this and continue to work on it. So we're back from annealing our piece. As you can tell, this has a lot more of a dull sound to it. It's nice and thin as we're going along the sides. Well, not thin, but it's nice and long as it's starting to elongate. And let's continue to draw this piece out. At this point, I'm actually going to switch to my slightly smaller hammerstone. This one's becoming a little hefty. And as I'm hitting the piece, I don't want it to deform too much as I work it down. So this hammerstone's still pretty good size. It's made of quartzite. And it's still going to allow me to get a nice heft to it, but it's not going to be too big and allow me to be a little more delicate as this piece thins out. Also going to give me more control. Again, as I'm elongating this piece, I am flipping it back and forth to allow me to kind of have an even keel as I thin out both the length, so getting that nice long length. Then I'm also thinning out the thickness and the height of this, trying to keep those even and trying to make those almost even with each other to more of a, if you looked at it from a cross-section view, being more of a square rather than a rectangle. We're not quite there yet, but we're slowly getting there. Our progress so far. Now let's anneal. So we're back from annealing, and we're going to continue to thin and elongate this piece. Again, using our medium-sized hammerstone. I'm getting a lot of flaking up and along that piece. Let's just scrape that out. Larger flake peeling up. Just gonna wedge that off. Go. Bring the area down. So again, continuing our elongation process as we continue to work the piece, and we'll run it through another set of annealing. So our preform is advancing quite nicely. We're going to continue thinning this out. We're getting kind of towards the end here. As you can see, the more we work it as it thins out, the quicker it's going to keep moving and the quicker it's going to elongate at this point. One thing you'll notice is that I'm turning the piece a lot more than I was previously. That's because as you begin to get to this a lot thinner and longer stage, the piece has a tendency to slip from kind of a square shaped, more of a rhombus type shape, kind of pushing both ends of that side. So it's really important as I'm working this that I continue to turn it so that I can keep this square shape that I like. If it starts to slip too much, at that point, I'm probably going to switch over to rounding this out to make a round awl. But at this point, I'm aiming to make a square one with sharp edges. It's also important that I'm watching where I place this on my anvil stone. My anvil stone isn't completely flat, so there's a couple little divots in it. And if I'm placing it in that, it's going to deform the piece and kind of start to make the piece bow. So I have this flatter surface over here on this part of my anvil, and I typically use this when I'm trying to keep these elongated pieces. As you can see, continuing to elongate, and we're slowly getting smaller on this piece. So let's anneal and keep working. So again, we're back from annealing. Our piece continues to get thinner, and we're going to continue to elongate this piece. Again, continuing to elongate, and we're going to anneal and keep working. Okay, we're getting quite thin, so we're going to continue to thin this out. We're pretty far along in our preform and getting to the point where we're going to begin starting to form our awl. Continuing to elongate, and now it's time to anneal. So we're starting to get close. As you can see, our piece is a lot longer, it's a lot thinner. We're going to continue working this until we can begin to fashion one side down and put a point on it. Okay, so our piece is continuing to thin out, and we will continue to work on this. All right, so we're continuing to work our thinned piece, getting very close to forming our awl. All right, what we have here is at the very end of this piece is starting to split open. So we're going to remove some of these flakes so that they do not cause us any more trouble. Other ones we will compact.
So that whole piece is starting to pry loose. So we're just going to force that off. Fortunately, it caused a lot of damage to our piece, but better off to remove it than to keep it on. Now what I'm doing is since I had to remove that piece, it significantly thinned down our edge here. So I'm actually going to make this the point of our awl now that it's a lot thinner. So I have to work out some of the damage that was caused by the removal of that piece stuff first, as well as continue to thin. So this is our piece so far. I'm going to anneal this and we'll continue to thin out this end and bring it to a point so that we can have our awl. So we're going to continue thinning our piece down here and drawing out this point. So I'm kind of doing a combination of continuing to draw this out by also pulling this tip thinner and thinner. You can see that taper is improving a lot as we're slowly not only elongating our piece now, but trying to draw out that point specifically. So I'm going to anneal this. I'm going to continue to thin out this main section as well as draw out this point a little bit more. So I'm going to continue working my piece starting about here where my fingers are, going this way, thinning this section out specifically, and then bringing this tip to even a narrower taper. All right, so you see I've definitely improved the taper. Here's the tip going along this way. I could use a little bit of hammering right here. So I'm going to anneal this one more time. I'm going to thin this out slightly, finally work this tip, and we will have a completed awl. All right, so this should be our final hammering process, and that should have been our final annealing. We're going to hammer a little bit here, and we're going to finish off this tip. Switch to my smaller hammer stone. All right, now we could continue to work on this piece to thin it down even more. That would depend on exactly what we're trying to make. I'm purposely leaving this a little bit thicker in case I'm trying to get a little more force behind something and even use this as potentially not only a awl, but a punch. So again, could continue to thin this. I'm going to stop here at this time. You can see it has that nice tapered edge going up to the top. The next step in this would be to actually use an abrader, such as sandstone, and to actually go through and remove any of this excess, potentially flakes here, and discoloring, as well as to sharpen up this tip and give it a nice point to it. But this is the end of the cold forging process that we're going to be going through in the creation of this awl. I will be posting a video in the future, actually going through the sanding and grinding down process of this tool. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like or subscribe and continue to come back to Cold Hammered Archaeology for future content on the native copper industry and future videos that I will be posting about experimental archaeology, working native copper. Thank you very much,
And thanks for coming.